All right, now let's talk about some of the ways in which the spinal cord is able to control muscle. So first of all, there are a couple of different sensory systems that are associated with muscle that tell the spinal cord and to some extent the brain what the muscles are doing. One of those is this thing here called the muscle spindle. So inside most skeletal muscles, there are these little bundles that contain fibers of their own. They're sort of encased in this fibrous capsule. So this is the inside of a muscle here. So if you look inside this capsule called the muscle spindle, it has smaller muscle fibers inside of it, and those muscle fibers are surrounded by mechanically activated sensory receptors. They're actually 1A, or what are also called A alpha axons. So if you recall back when we talked about the somatosensory system, those A alpha axons are the thickest and the most heavily myelinated of all the somatosensory axons. So they send information back to the brain, or back to the spinal cord, very, very quickly. And they are activated whenever the fibers inside the muscle spindle are stretched. So anything that pulls on either end of the muscle, so if you have stretching in this direction, for example, that will activate these axons or produce action potentials in these axons that then get communicated back to the brain. So these are basically the stretch receptors of the muscle. And so something that would stretch a muscle would be some sort of external force, like if if there were some weight applied to a muscle or to the body that counteracted the motion of the muscle, that would stretch it out or lengthen it. So in other words, these can also be considered the length detectors within the muscle. And you can see how they work here. So these, if we're looking at the weight attached to a muscle, so here, they've made it look like they've attached a weight to a muscle, but again, you can produce this just by having a weight attached at the end of a joint, and that causes the muscle to be stretched. So here you can see the length of the muscle, and what happens is as the weight is applied, the muscle lengthens because of stretching. So again, this is the muscle being stretched, and as the muscle is stretched, the axon, the 1A axon, starts to fire action potentials. So these little spikes, remember, are action potentials coming from this neuron right here. So we're in the green area here, we're recording from these axons, and then these 1A axons, they have peripheral processes that go out to the muscle spindle, but then they have a central process that goes into the spinal cord through the dorsal horn, just like the somatosensory receptors go in. But they synapse directly onto alpha motor neurons. So the alpha motor neurons that they synapse onto are usually the exact same muscle that the sensory or the muscle spindle was in. So that means that this neuron here synapses onto this alpha motor neuron, and that excites this alpha motor neuron, which means that whenever this 1A axon is active, this alpha motor neuron is also active, and that's what you see here. So this bottom line is recording from this alpha motor neuron here. So these are action potentials being produced by the motor neuron. And of course, the motor neuron, when it is active, it sends action potentials down its axon to the muscle. And as we know now, when the muscle is active, it starts to contract. And that contraction will, of course, make the muscle shorter. So what you see is as soon as the 1A axon fires, the muscle alpha motor neuron starts to activate, and that causes the muscle to start to contract. So at that exact moment, or pretty close to it, the muscle starts to shorten again. So the muscle length starts to get smaller because the muscle itself is contracting. And so it's essentially counteracting that that stretching. So that's the job of these stretch receptors, is to tell the spinal cord that the muscle is being stretched or lengthened by some sort of external force, and then it allows the muscle to contract in response to that force and to sort of counteract it. So a demonstration of this, an easy one to show, is the so-called myotatic reflex. This is sometimes called the Kneejerk Reflex because it's pretty easy to demonstrate it with your knee. So if you're sitting in a chair, it's actually easier if you're sitting on a table. But then if you can do this to yourself, or you can have someone else do it to you. But if you just lightly tap the tendon between your kneecap and your shin, what you will find is that your lower leg will kick out. Again, this is called the Kneejerk Reflex. So here's kind of what that looks like. Again, you can do this to yourself or have someone do it to you, but if you just sort of gently tap on that tendon, it'll cause the knee to kick out. Again, this works best if your foot is not touching the ground, so that it has room to kind of swing back and forth. And what causes this reflex is when you tap on that tendon, what you're also doing is very, very briefly, you're stretching this quadriceps muscle. So the quadriceps muscle is the extensor muscle for your knee. This is the muscle that causes your leg to straighten at the knee. So when you tap that tendon, the muscle stretches. That stretching is detected by the muscle spindle, which is inside the quadriceps muscle. That sends a signal along this 1A afferent back to the spinal cord. That activates the motor neuron, which controls the quadriceps muscle, and then that makes the quadricep muscle contract. So that's why the leg kicks out or extends very, very briefly. And the job of this reflex, and other reflexes like it, is for to allow your muscles to react to some sort of external force. So something that would cause your your muscles to stretch like this could be, for example, if someone were to push you from behind, and so or from any side, that would cause some of your leg muscles to stretch out as they were bent, and then that contraction, the reflex that leads to that contraction would help counteract that kind of movement. Same thing if you were to try to catch a heavy weight, for example. The downward force of the weight as you caught it would stretch out some of the muscles in your arms, and then the contraction of those arm muscles in response would help keep your arms from just dropping whatever it was that you were trying to catch. So those are just examples of how the myotatic reflex is useful. By the way, the term reflex is specific, so we may have mentioned it before, but a reflex generally refers to a circuit like this, where you have a sensory receptor directly or through just one or two synapses connecting with a motor neuron. What's important is that it does not involve the brain. So, even though information from these stretch receptors can make their way to the brain sort of indirectly, the reflex itself does not require any input from the brain at all. So this happens, in fact, before your brain's even aware probably that there's been something's happened in your leg. So then another part of the muscle spindle are these muscle fibers that are inside of it. And these are called intrafusal muscle fibers. So if you look inside the muscle spindle, these muscle fibers are in there, and they're called intrafusal just because they're inside those spindles. The other muscles that are not inside the muscle spindle we call extrafusal, and those are the extrafusal fibers are the ones that actually cause most of the muscle contraction itself. But the intrafusal muscle fibers contract pretty much the same way that the extrafusal muscle fibers do. They're just smaller, and there are fewer of them. And the other difference is that unlike the extrafusal muscle fibers, they are not controlled by alpha motor neurons. Instead, they're controlled by a subset of motor neurons called gamma motor neurons. So the gamma motor neurons and alpha motor neurons, their cell bodies are both in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. But again, the alpha motor neurons synapse with the extrafusal fibers, and the gamma motor neurons synapse with the intrafusal fibers. But otherwise, they do the same thing. So when the gamma motor neurons are activated, they cause the intrafusal muscle fibers to contract. So why would you want there to be a separate set of muscle fibers inside the spindle that causes contraction? The reason is that these muscle spindles only work as length detectors or stretch detectors if there's tension in them. So if the muscle is contracting, so if you're contracting a muscle, then by definition the muscle should be getting shorter, and when the muscle gets shorter, the tension in the muscle spindle goes away. In other words, the capsule that connects the intrafusal fibers or the muscle spindle to the muscle kind of goes slack. So that's what's happening here. This muscle spindle has lost the tension in it because the muscle has contracted, which means that if then something causes this muscle to stretch while it's contracted, the spindle won't be able to detect that. So the spindle only works if there's tension in it, which will allow it to be able to tell when it's being stretched. So the job of the gamma motor neurons is basically to trigger the contraction of the intrafusal muscle fibers. So the intrafusal muscle fibers, or the gamma motor neurons, will activate at the same time or immediately after activation of the alpha motor neurons. That's what's happening here, and that will basically pull on the ends of the muscle spindle and sort of make the connections taut again. So that's what's happening here. Now there's tension in that muscle spindle because the gamma motor neuron is pulling on those intrafusal fibers or causing the intrafusal fibers to contract. And so that tension allows the spindle fibers to then communicate information to the spinal cord about the length of the muscle. So that's the main job of these gamma motor neurons. It's just a mechanism to maintain tension inside those muscle spindles. And then another sensory structure associated with muscle is the Golgi tendon organ. So a tendon, we mentioned, is just the tissue that connects the muscle to the bone. Tendons are not contractile, so they do not have muscle fibers in them. They do not have the ability to contract on their own. Mostly tendons consist of fibers of this protein called collagen. Collagen is an important sort of extracellular protein in your body. In fact, it's probably the most abundant protein in your body of all the individual proteins that you make. And so it's found all over the place, but especially important in tendons. It's very strong, but very flexible, and it's important for just keeping the muscles attached to the bone. But inside most tendons, there's this structure called a tendon organ, where basically it's just a bundle of these collagen fibrils that are entangled with axons from a subset of the A alpha sensory axons called 1B axons. And again, they're like the 1A axons. They're very thick and heavily myelinated, so they send communication to the brain very quickly, or to the spinal cord anyway. And they're activated. They're mechanically sensitive, just like the muscle spindle axons. But they're activated when there's tension in this Golgi tendon organ. So when there's tension in the tendon, the collagen fibrils kind of squeeze this axon. That triggers the mechanically gated ion channels in the axon, and that causes an action potential to go back to the spinal cord. So that's the job of these axons, is to detect tension in the muscle, or at least tension in the tendon, which presumably is caused by tension in the muscle. And then the job of the muscle Golgi tendon organ. And so this is kind of showing you what's happening here. Here's a muscle. Here they've sort of attached it to a fixed apparatus, which means that when it contracts, it can't actually contract. In other words, it can't get shorter. It can't create motion. So instead of actually getting shorter, it just creates tension in the muscle. And this is simulating like trying to lift a really heavy weight. So if you try to lift something that's really, really heavy, you'll contract your muscles, but your muscles won't actually move because they're not able to create enough force to move the weight off the ground. And so that signal again comes in from the brain, and then these this tension is detected by these 1B axons in the Golgi tendon organ, and so they send a signal back to the brain. That's what's happening here. So this neuron is not being activated by the motor neuron. Instead, it's being activated by the tension in the muscle, which was caused by the motor neuron. The Golgi tendon organ is responsible for another kind of reflex called the reverse myotatic reflex. So remember, the myotatic reflex is just a fancy name for the Kneejerk reflex, and as we'll see in a second, this is kind of the reverse of that. So the reverse myotatic reflex starts when the Golgi tendon organ detects tension. So if this muscle is under tension, that will activate this 1B axon from the Golgi tendon organ, and that communicates back to the spinal cord where it synapses onto inhibitory interneurons. So this little guy here is an inhibitory interneuron within the gray matter of the spinal cord. Those neurons then synapse onto alpha motor neurons, and in particular the alpha motor neurons that control this muscle. So basically what happens is when the muscle is experiencing tension, the Golgi tendon organ tells the motor neuron via this inhibitory interneuron to stop, basically to remove that tension by relaxing. And the function or the purpose for this reflex is mostly to prevent damage, because of course tension in a muscle up to a certain point can cause damage. You can either tear a muscle or tear a tendon, and you can in fact contract a muscle or create enough force with a muscle that it can cause it to tear itself or tear itself from the bone. And so the Golgi tendon organ's job is to help prevent that. It basically is a negative feedback loop that once the tendon is stretched or experiences tension beyond a certain point, it inhibits the muscle and removes that tension by causing the muscle to relax. So that's why we call it the reverse myotatic reflex, because the myotatic reflex causes muscle to contract in response to the stretch receptors in the muscle spindles, whereas in this case the tendon organ is inhibiting the muscle in response to tension in the tendon. These are also important feedback receptors that tell the spinal cord and the brain kind of how much tension's on the muscle, and therefore how much force a muscle is applying, which is important for certain kinds of fine motor control. So some sorts of movements require perhaps delicate force to be applied, and so this is one way for the spinal cord at least to know how much tension or force a muscle is exerting. So these receptors and these neurons together can create more complex reflexes, which can be used to produce some more complex movements. This is an example of something called reciprocal inhibition. So again, when you want to move any part of your body, it requires contracting the muscles that will produce force in the direction that you want the body to move. So for example, if you want to bend your elbow, that means you want to flex this joint, which means the flexor muscles of the elbow need to contract. Remember, that includes the biceps muscle in the upper arm. So of course there are alpha motor neurons, these guys here, that directly tell the biceps muscle to contract. So when they do that, the muscle will contract. And at the same time, when a muscle contracts, you want its antagonist muscle to relax. So something, for example, that would trigger contraction of the biceps muscle would be if the muscle spindle in the biceps was stretched. So remember, those are the stretch receptors. So if there's a force on this muscle, which could happen again because there's a weight on the arm. So let's say again that you're trying to catch something with this hand here. So the downward force of of a weight perhaps on this hand would be something that could trigger the stretching of this muscle, right? And that stretching then would activate this muscle spindle, which then sends a signal back to the spinal cord, which triggers the alpha motor neuron to tell the biceps muscle to contract. But again, this only works, or it only will create the movement that you want. So again, if the muscle responds, then it will contract in the opposite direction of the stretching, and the arm will move back the other way. So again, this would be useful if, say, you were trying to catch a heavy weight. But this only works if the antagonist muscle, which in this case would be the triceps muscle, is not contracting, because if they're contracting at the same time, then that will kind of counteract the activity of the flexor muscle. So these 1A axons also have collaterals that communicate with inhibitory interneurons for the antagonist muscle. So in this case, when the biceps muscle is contracted, or when the muscle spindle in the biceps is activated, that activates the motor neuron for the biceps, but it inhibits the motor neuron for the triceps, which is the antagonist of the biceps. So that just makes sure that the triceps muscle and the other extensor muscles in the arm are relaxed, so that the muscle or that the arm can go through flexion. And of course, there'd be a similar circuit that connected the muscle spindle of the triceps to its muscle, and then that would inhibit the alpha motor neuron that controls the biceps. And you notice too, this is this loop here, the 1A axon, and the motor neuron for the muscle, that is the same as the myotatic reflex. So the myotatic reflex is part of this reciprocal inhibition circuit. And we call it reciprocal inhibition because, again, whatever the flexor is doing, whenever the flexor is contracting, it's going to relax the extensor, and vice versa. So anytime you have antagonist muscles, they should be doing the opposite things at any given time, if they're not both relaxed at the same time. This is another example of a reflex. This is called the Flexor reflex. So this reflex is triggered by pain axons, either in the arms or the legs, the hands or the feet, I should say. Again, let's say you're walking around your house and you've stepped on something sharp and painful. That's going to activate pain receptors in the foot. So we've talked about how pain receptors work. They're activated by anything that could cause damage to your tissue. So here, this little tack would be enough to activate that axon. And so that axon sends an action potential back to the spinal cord. And then those neurons do communicate with the brain, but they also have branches that come off and synapse with, in this time, excitatory interneurons in the spinal cord. So an interneuron, remember, is any neuron that only communicates with other neurons, especially other neurons that are within sort of the same part of the nervous system. So these interneurons have very short axons that go straight to the alpha motor neurons for, in this case, the flexor muscles of the leg. And the reason you want the flexor muscles to contract is because the response to this painful stimulus is, or should be, to pull that part of the body away from the thing that caused the pain. So in this case, if you stepped on a tack, you want to take your foot away from that pain. Same thing if you reached out and touched a hot stove. Your first reflex will be to pull your arm away from that, and that involves contracting the flexor muscles in that limb. So in this case, you're contracting the flexor muscles in the leg, which will bring your foot up away from the attack. So again, these muscles are contracting, and again, that motion causes the knee to, in this case, causes the knee to bend, but it also causes the foot to lift up if the other joints are doing the same thing. So this is just called the flexor reflex, and it's just a simple connection between pain receptors in this case the foot, and then the flexor muscles of the knee. And of course, you wouldn't want your extensor muscles to have this reflex, because your extensor muscles would cause the knee or the leg to straighten out, which is not what you need in this case. Again, this is a very rapid reflex. These pain receptors do communicate with the brain, but this all happens before the brain even gets the signal. So remember, these are pain receptors in your foot. They're generally very slow anyway, and so the signal has to get all the way to your brain before you become consciously aware of it. And of course, by then you've already damaged the foot. So these reflexes are there to allow your muscles to react to painful stimuli very, very quickly, without the brain having to detect that information and process it and then have to send the signal back down the spinal cord to activate the muscle. And then related to the flexor reflex, this is called the crossed extensor reflex. So again, let's say you're walking around your house, you step on a tack. At least now you're wearing pants, but the flexor reflex will cause you to lift your foot off the ground. Now, again, if this happens to your arm, this is not a problem. But if this happens to your foot, now you have a problem, because now you have one foot off the ground and one foot still on the ground. And that means that now you're going to lose your balance. So what you need is for the other leg to straighten out to help support your body and keep yourself from falling down. And the crossed extensor reflex takes care of that. So the crossed extensor reflex is just built from a bunch of simpler reflexes. So we already talked about the flexor reflex, which you can see here. This orange cell is the pain receptor, bringing information from the foot that, again, the sensory stimulus that you have stepped on the tack. And that synapses on a bunch of interneurons here in the ventral horn, including the excitatory neuron that's going to activate the flexor muscle. So that's this reflex. It's just the flexor reflex here. So this loop here is really just the flexor reflex. But then at the same time, you have that same neuron activating an inhibitory interneuron, which is the neuron which will then synapse onto the motor neuron, which controls the extensor muscle for the same leg. And that should look familiar because it's exactly the same thing as this reciprocal inhibition mechanism. So this circuit right here, this connection between the sensory cell, this inhibitory interneuron, and the extensor muscle, is an example of reciprocal inhibition. Reciprocal inhibition. So again, that is there to make sure that the extensor muscle is relaxed while you're trying to bend your knee and move it away from the ground. And then a third pathway takes an excitatory signal through an interneuron to the other side of the spinal cord to control the muscles of the other leg. And so here you've got an excitatory interneuron being activated by this commissural axon. So commissural means something that crosses the midline. So this is a commissural axon that comes over, activates another excitatory interneuron, which then activates the motor neuron that it controls the extensor muscles of the opposite leg. So in this case, the stimulus came from the left side, and now we're sending a signal to the right side. So the extensor muscles on the right side contract, which make the leg straighten out. And meanwhile, you also want the flexor muscles to relax, which would to prevent the extensor muscles from allow them to be more effective. And that is important for just keeping the other leg straight to help keep your balance. Now, there's other muscles involved in that kind of movement. You would need some of your trunk or axial muscles involved to just keep your posture upright during this time. But at the very basic level, this crossed extensor reflex is to help you just from falling down when you pull your leg up. But again, it's built up from a simpler set of reflexes. And in a lot of ways, pretty much every movement and everything the nervous system does is like this. It's just a complicated circuit that's built up from a lot of simpler circuits. So another example of an important reflex or set of reflexes in that's controlled by the spinal cord are these circuits called central pattern generators. So a central pattern generator is a circuit that exists in some parts of the spinal cord that have the ability to produce rhythmic alternating activity in response to continuous input or continuous excitatory input from the brain. So these kinds of circuits are really important for any kind of rhythmic movement. A good example is walking. Walking is a rhythmic alternating motion. So when you walk, you are contracting your extensor muscles every time of one leg. So let's say if you take a step with your right leg, you contract the muscles, the extensor muscles of the right leg to step forward, and then once that foot is on the ground, then you contract the flexor muscles of the left leg to bring that leg up, and then contract the extensor muscles of the left leg to stretch it out again. And then you repeat that process with every step. Now, of course, you don't think about all those movements on contracting all those muscles while you're walking. It would be very difficult to do that. So instead, your brain can just send a sort of on signal to the spinal cord. It can just say walk, and then these central pattern generators kind of create the output necessary for that activity. So the input, again, in this case, is excitatory input from the brain, and later we'll talk about how information gets from the brain to the spinal cord. But these are just excitatory axons coming from neurons somewhere in the brain. They activate this circuit, and then the output comes from the motor neurons. These are the motor neurons down here for the flexor and extensor muscles of one leg. So what you're seeing here is that they're activated, but they produce these bursts of action potentials that are rhythmic and alternating. So the flexor muscle, or I mean the extensor muscle in this case, is activated first, and then the flexor muscle is activated afterward. And while one is active, the other one is quiet. So here the flexor muscle is generating a burst of action potentials. So if you draw this line here, you can kind of see how the timing works. So again, while the extensor motor neuron is active, the flexor motor neuron is quiet, and vice versa. So this means that presumably the extensor muscle will be contracting while the flexor muscle is relaxed, and then over here, when the flexor muscle is contracting, the extensor muscle will be relaxed. So this, if these are the motor neurons associated with, say, the muscles of the knee, then this kind of rhythmic alternating pattern would cause the knee to bend and extend and bend and extend with each cycle. So the question is, how does this circuit convert continuous input into a rhythmic alternating input? And it doesn't require a whole lot of circuitry. Basically, there are excitatory interneurons that are activated by the continuous input from the brain, and then inhibitory interneurons that are connected between the two of those, which basically make sure that when one neuron's active, the other one is quiet. So if this neuron, this excitatory neuron, is active, meaning these little action potentials are firing, then it has a collateral that goes to an interneuron, an inhibitory interneuron, and that inhibitory interneuron then will inhibit the excitatory neuron for the other muscle. So again, when activity in this pathway causes extensor contraction, activity in this pathway would cause flexor contraction. And so the inhibitory interneurons in both cases just make sure that when one is active, the other one is quiet. So while this neuron's active, this neuron's quiet. While this neuron's active, this one is quiet. And then what's also important is that these interneurons produce rhythmic behavior. So they go through this cyclic sort of on-off pattern. So they produce bursts of action potentials, and then they go quiet, and then they produce another burst, and then they go quiet. So the question is, how do they do that? So if you look at the receptors expressed by these interneurons, they have this rhythmic firing activity. So if you record, let's say you were to record the membrane potential of one of these neurons in the presence of glutamate, you would see that it produces this burst of action potentials followed by hyperpolarization, and then another burst, and then another round of hyperpolarization. So again, they kind of fire rhythmically like this. And there are lots of neurons in the nervous system and other parts of the nervous system too that have this sort of innate rhythmic kind of firing pattern. And the way this mechanism works is through the NMDA receptors. So if you remember, NMDA receptors are a type of glutamate receptor. So that means when glutamate's present, and glutamate is the neurotransmitter being released by these synapses. So we have presumably being released here, we have glutamate, and then either the excitatory interneurons or these inhibitory interneurons, either one, may have these NMDA receptors, and again, NMDA receptors show up in a lot of other places as well. But what's important is that they bind to glutamate, and when glutamate is present, it causes the channel to open. And if the channel's open, it lets both calcium and sodium go through, and that both depolarizes the membrane, but also calcium, remember, acts as an important kind of intracellular signaling ion. So calcium coming in when glutamate's present here. So when the cell's at rest, the NMDA receptors are closed. When glutamate's present, and the cell, and if the cell is depolarized enough, then these channels will open. That then depolarizes the membrane enough to trigger a burst of action potentials. So again, the depolarization caused by the sodium influx causes the action potentials, and then that in turn creates the output from this neuron, which then gets turned into rhythmic activity of the motor neuron. And then at the same time, or immediately after the neuron fires, another set of channels, which are calcium sensitive potassium channels, become open. So these are potassium channels which are in the membrane of the same cells that are activated by intracellular calcium. So only calcium inside the cell will cause these channels to open. And when they open, they let calcium through. And these neurons, just like most neurons, have a large negative potassium current, large negative potassium equilibrium potential. So potassium ions leave. That brings the membrane potential back down. In other words, it becomes hyperpolarized, and that turns off the firing pattern, or causes the neuron to stop firing. So that's what's happening in this phase right here. As the neuron fires, or as the potassium leaves and brings the membrane potential down, that eventually quiets the cell. But then something else happens when you hyperpolarize the membrane, and that is that you deactivate these NMDA receptors. The reason is that NMDA receptors also can get blocked by magnesium ions. So magnesium ions are similar to calcium ions, but they cannot fit through the NMDA receptor ion channel. So even though glutamate is present, when the membrane is hyperpolarized, meaning the membrane potential it becomes negative enough, these magnesium ions get into the channel of the receptor and block it. So both the calcium and sodium currents through these channels stop. But without calcium, there's nothing to keep these potassium channels open. So the calcium current goes away, and then the potassium current also goes away because of that. And so the lack of potassium current then allows the membrane to repolarize. So that's what's happening here. The membrane starts to repolarize, to become more depolarized. And then eventually that triggers another burst of action potentials. But then the cycle repeats because now there's calcium again. So we opened up those NMDA receptors, calcium returns, and that allows us to do this all over again. So this whole cycle just repeats over and over as long as glutamate's present. So as soon as the glutamate goes away, which means that the signal from the brain has gone away, the firing stops. And so this is just the mechanism, again, through these NMDA channels, that allows this neuron, these types of neurons, to produce this sort of intrinsic, rhythmic, alternating firing pattern. And then that circuit is important for producing those kinds of movements like walking. In fact, again, one of the problems with the spinal cord is that it is the only way for your brain to communicate with the muscles of your body. So if you have a spinal cord injury, that means the axons that send signals from the brain to the spinal cord get cut, and then the brain no longer can control those muscles. That's why people with spinal cord injuries have paralysis of muscles from the injury point below. And in fact, these central pattern generators have been a target of people who research spinal cord injury, because they hypothetically could act as a mechanism for helping people who've lost control of, say, their leg muscles to have some control of their muscles and perhaps walk, because again, these neurons don't need the brain to tell them to produce every individual movement. They just need sort of an on signal, and then they sort of create intrinsically this rhythmic behavior that allows or is necessary for movements like walking. And so that potentially could be a mechanism if you could somehow bypass the injury, either artificially using some sort of electrodes, or perhaps getting the axons through the injury to regrow. You could hypothetically allow someone with that kind of injury to regain some of their mobility. Anyway, that's it for this chapter. In the next chapter, we'll talk about how the brain controls the motor systems.